Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I'll just add a few things. I know a lot of areas have been canvassed already, and we did mention some things when we debated the motion put by the member for Hobart, so that helps cut through some of the matters. I reiterate that I found the briefing pack useful, and the consultation process clearly furnished some useful things to be considered and resulted in some changes to this bill. The one I particularly mentioned that I was pleased to see when I read the consultation report was that the process of that consultation gave rise to changes being made in reasons having to be published for decisions and things being made more transparent in that way. So it was excellent that those who participated in the consultation were able to call for that clearly, and then that there was a responsiveness to that. That was particularly in instances where the minister may not have taken the advice provided by the TPC, for example, having to provide reasons into the public domain for that decision is particularly appropriate and useful now to have in the bill. So thank you to those who made the decisions about including those sorts of elements of transparency. Regardless of that, there were still some concerns that remained from various groups, and we've heard some others give voice to those. I won't go through them exhaustively. The things that I'll just mention a few things because they're probably things that I may have questions for in the committee stage as we go through, and so I'll just flag them now because some of them may be able to be dealt with ahead of committee stage, or we may follow up at that time. In terms of minor amendments of SPPs, the section of the bill that deals with that, and in particular I'm thinking of Section 8, the bit around 30NA. Those minor amendments in that section have been grouped fairly helpfully, I think, into some levels of minor. And so the most straightforward minor amendments, typos, numerical fixes, things like that, have been designated as matters that are not of high consequence, and therefore the minister doesn't have to seek advice about those, and that makes sense. Then there's a category in the list there of various things that the minister must seek advice on. Of course, the minister still has the discretion to take that advice or not, but it's good to see some of those matters that, although they're here under the heading of minor, have been recognised as perhaps being of more consequence and therefore requiring advice to be sought by the minister, I think is a positive way to indicate that potential greater consequence there. So that makes sense to me and I think is useful. It does, though, beg the question, if they have been determined to be minor and then it's been determined, though, that the minister must seek advice on them, there's clearly some things that can be of consequence in relation to them. So I'm wondering about the parameters of some of those. I do know that when we're talking about matters to do with planning, it can occur at times that the possible impact of something can be minimised somewhat in presenting it to us for consideration, and the lightest touch of the impact of those matters might be presented as the most likely thing that could occur. And that may be so, but then things also can have possible greater consequences, and it can be easy to skate across the top of those. And so I'm always interested to understand well, not just what might be the most likely impacts and consequence that may be deemed minor, but also what could be the greater impact and consequence, or the more consequential example. So that might be some area of focus for questions during the committee stage in the list there around minor amendments to the SPPs. In terms of interim amendments to SPPs made at the minister's instigation, which can happen even in the case, I believe, of the TPC providing advice that a draft amendment should not be made on an interim basis in that matter. It says that those can be made when the minister is satisfied that the situation is urgent, critical, significant, when it's in the public interest. I'm interested to explore more around the parameters of that. Those external stakeholders, some external stakeholders have raised the fact that there's potential greater consequence that can be captured in these spaces, and so I'm interested in whether we do have the right checks and balances there around ministerial discretion. I'm particularly interested because I think that public safety aspect is described there. There's some particular examples given around bushfire management or housing-related matters, but clearly in the bill it's not limited to just these, and so there is some broader potential consequence there or options there that may not be visible to us immediately that could come about. One of the things that was a matter of some confusion and needed to be really teased out across the two briefings we had from the department and the briefings we had from the other stakeholders like PMAT and then also the Minister, and it did take some back and forth to get clarity, is around that change of process when it comes to substantial modifications to draft LPS local provision schedules. It's an interesting one because I understand the argument that an LPS having been considered and largely found to be approved and appropriate, at the present time is being held up if there's something within it that has been deemed to be requiring substantial modification, because that then needs to go through its own process. And therefore the whole lot's being potentially held up, potentially for 6 to 7 months, we've been informed. I understand the rationale that what this bill is allowing for is that the LPS can go ahead once it's been approved in almost whole, with the part that's designated as needing substantial modification in place to be then amended subsequently. And in the interim time, while that amendment process plays out, which would involve the public consultation elements and those matters, in the meantime, the direction for the substantial modification from the TPC stands as the rules on that thing, even though it hasn't been yet publicly consulted on. Matters relating to it would have been consulted on when the draft LPSs were considered in their whole. But the direction that came from the TPC about a need for the substantial modification, that hasn't yet been consulted on, and yet it stands as the rules for a period of time while the amendment process plays out. Now, that's an interesting thing for us to contemplate and balance out and think about, is this appropriate? What are the risks and benefits? There's a potential benefit to that because it can put in place arrangements that many people might deem to be protective of an area that isn't currently in place at an earlier time. So I understand that to be a potential way this might play out, and by many, and perhaps those who have raised concerns, but also be seen to be a positive, that at the earlier opportunity we put in place protective things that the TPC has deemed should be appropriately put in as a substantial modification to that particular LPS. Then the public consultation plays out, the amendment plays out, and then it is officially put in place when that, if it is passed. So there could be earlier protection. And then the other side of that is that there could be an arrangement put in place that where the substantial modification directed by the TPC becomes the rules while an amendment is considered for it to be officially put in place. And approvals and things might be decided under that, which then, once the amendment process plays out with its full public consultation, then actually results in changes or finding that actually it wasn't appropriate. And so things may have been decided or put in place or put in train that then were seen to be not the way forward and of concern to people, and not what the public ultimately made their representations on. So this could work either way. And what it comes back to when we're considering about our support of it or not, and whether it's a valid thing to be putting in place at this time, whether it's necessary to make a change from the way it is now to that, it really comes back to, I think, from my assessment, having to have a fairly substantial measure of faith and confidence in the assessment and the decision-making of the TPC. Because ultimately what we're resting on in terms of whether that does go into a positive or potentially a damaging outcome will rest on those measures the TPC has made around the substantial modifications, the direction they've made around that, which becomes rules for a period of time without having been consulted on publicly. And we're putting our faith that that will more likely go in a good direction than a bad one. That's a very wordy way of trying to break that down, but I wanted to try and put the process on the public record that we had to give consideration to as we worked our way through these briefings and came to understand what this change would mean that's in the bill. I still feel concerned about it. I still am concerned that something becomes the rules before it's been consulted on publicly with people able to put forward their thoughts and have them heard in the decision-making process about the value of that. I recognise that in some sense it's been covered by an earlier consultation, but not in its entirety, so I still have concerns about that. When it comes to planning, I suspect, generally err on the side of wanting to see the public as involved and able to have a say as possible, and for any process to be have administrative justice and also be as transparent and accountable as possible.
You've got to live with the results.
Indeed. I suspect this bill is going to go through, so this is what we're going to have to work with, and I just would put it on the public record that what we're relying on here then is the TPC to have made those decisions and directions about substantial modifications in a way that results in positive outcomes and reduces the risk of negative outcomes for the community. Let me just double-check my notes for other points. That might be all. There'll be some questions I may have that come up through the committee stage. But I thank other members for going through some of those other concerns that have been raised, and I just want to acknowledge that there is still concern about this. It would have been my preference for this to be looked at by a committee because I think it warrants it. I think the delay that it may have caused is a warranted and would have been a valuable delay. Because we are the last cab on the rank, in a sense, as something comes through, something that has been, initiated as policy by the government and it goes through its processes to be developed. It ultimately, eventually comes to Parliament. It goes through the other place, and we are the last station, I guess, for the train. And what that means is that when it is a matter of taking some extra time and consideration at that last station, at this point in the process, it can look like unreasonable or unacceptable delay, because suddenly the urgency that may have been there or may have cropped up because other elements of that process have taken an extended or unnecessary or unreasonable amount of time, we're the ones who then wear the pressure of that. And that's a shame, because this point in the process, this final station for the train in its travels, is actually a really important one. And I don't think we should ever shy away or feel the need to excuse the need for us to have time to do our job appropriately and to take the opportunities we've created in our processes, like our Committee A and Committee B opportunities to review or inquire or provide extra scrutiny. I don't think we should ever have to feel that we should put those aside. We're just as valid a point in the process as any of those other points along the way, from the time of conceiving of a policy through to it becoming a law. And I would encourage members here to always remember that that is our role, that we are as entitled to do our role well as everybody else who's been involved in the process prior to it arriving here. And I would encourage the government and any government of the day bringing matters to us to also respect and remember that that's our role. And just because we are the last station on the journey that the train travels doesn't mean we have to bear the pressure and feel that we have to rush or not do our job to the extent that it deserves. So with that, I'll conclude my contribution, Madam Deputy President.
The question is